Thanks everyone for coming to the final City Forum of the spring semester. As most of you know, City Forum is our bi-weekly seminar series where we hear from scholars, community leaders, practicing planners, and decision makers. We're all engaged in the critical questions and issues that shape our cities and regions. I'm Alex Carner, Associate Professor of Community Regional Planning here at UT. And this has been my first year as a City Forum Director. I feel like I've learned a lot. And I'm looking forward to making things even better next year. So as always, if you have ideas about speakers or topics, please reach out to me wherever you can find me in person or on social media or whatever. Today, we're very lucky to have Heather Way as our City Forum speaker. Heather's a clinical professor in School of Law here at Texas. She's worked here since 2006. Prior to that, she founded the Texas Community Building with Attorney Resources, which is an organization that gives free legal services to community development organizations and other nonprofits. And prior to that, she clerked for Judge William Wayne Justice of the U.S. District Court for the Eastern District of Texas after completing her law degree at UT. Within CRP, we're super familiar with Professor Way because she was a co-author on the Equitable report that's been really influential in local conversations around gentrification and displacement and thinking about what we can do about it. And then more recently, along with several CRP students and some law students, Professor Way produced a report entitled Ousted, which highlights the disparate impacts and illegal nature of the city of San Antonio's aggressive use of code enforcement tools to displace residents. And it's generated quite a buzz, I think it's safe to say.
Yes.
So today, she'll be talking with us about the strengths and limitations of property tax exemptions that can be used to support affordable housing development in Texas. And for those of you who don't know Heather's work, I think you're in for a treat. Throughout the presentation, you'll get the sense that she's a kindred spirit, and the goals that she pursues through legal research and action are very similar to those that we pursue from within planning, research, and practice. We're very happy that she's here. So let's welcome Professor Way.
Thanks, Dr. Carter. I just want to thank y'all for joining me. It is a beautiful Friday, and like to come out and listen to a law professor talk about property tax exemption programs. Oh my gosh. And this was originally going to be a two-part presentation. I was going to talk about two different tax tools. And as I was preparing this week, I realized that one was enough, one just in terms of the time and content, but also like, I didn't want to bore you to death with two tax tools. I'm just going to bore you to death with one tax tool. So I was sparing you the second one. So I'm just going to focus, as Dr. Conner said, on property tax exemptions as a tool to both preserve and create affordable housing, multifamily rental housing, affordable multifamily rental housing here in the state of Texas. This is a topic that doesn't actually get that much attention. I think people have a tendency sort of to veer away from anything that has a little tax in it, but it's a really important conversation to have, as you'll see in the slides I'm going to present to you today. So, oops, I'm looking at I've got lost two screens. Let me click the right thing. Just a quick outline of my presentation. I want to spend a good amount of time just giving some framing for you all, because before I get to sort of the policy conversation, I think it's important that you have just an overall framing of the policy overview, the policy framework of how the different property tax exemption tools that are on the books today for affordable multifamily rental housing. And then I'm going to really be honing in on the newest tool, which is this public facility corporation leasehold interest tool that I'm going to start explaining what that is. And then be spending some time sort of closing out, talking about what I see as the main pitfalls with this tools, and what I see as some key things that need to happen to make this tool work more effectively and more equitably. And so then we'll have time for Q&A, and my hope is to spend about 45 minutes on this presentation and then really have some time for discussion and conversation with you all online as well as here in the room. But so, okay, let's go ahead and jump in with sort of this overview. For those of us who work in the affordable housing field, when we think about subsidies for affordable housing, the things that usually come to mind are things like grants and loans and the federal low-income housing tax credit program, which is one of the largest subsidy programs for affordable housing that's done through the federal income tax code. There's things like taxes and bonds, which is like this sort of federal, state, local tool that's allowed for under federal law. And you have things, you may have heard of things like your project-based, tenant-based vouchers. So these are things that normally come to mind when we're thinking about subsidies for affordable housing. But there's also property taxes. I'm wondering I'm going to see if I can change, hold up real quick, see if I can delete this thing on here. Does anyone know how to hide it? I just want to make sure those online
floating meeting controls.
hide me control, excuse
Down.
us.
Yeah,
Here we go, hide.
down, like three down.
One more down.
Where we're at, hide floating meeting controls. There we go, okay.
Perfect.
Oops, and then I don't want to be, okay, here we go, technical difficulties. Okay, so property tax exemptions have also been on the books and have been around for a very long time in terms of supporting, subsidizing both the creation and preservation of affordable housing. And in Texas, this is actually a really important tool because we don't have an income tax here in the state of Texas, and we do rely heavily on property taxes. And the property taxes on this example here, a 270 unit apartment complex in Austin, can range anywhere from $1 million to $2 million a year. And if you break that down, that's $305 to $617 a unit per month. That's a lot. That's a big part of your rent as a renter that's going towards helping your landlord pay the property tax bill. So when it comes to giving a property tax exemption, it is a really big subsidy and a really big important tool. So you sort of total up over time, if you're giving an exemption to this property over 20 years, assuming that the tax break was $1.5 million a year, it's a $30 million subsidy by giving that property tax break that's being put into that property. So, but unlike other subsidy programs that are coming out of the pockets of that governmental entity, with property tax exemptions, let's say it's the Travis County Housing Authority, for example, that is partnering with the developer to provide this $30 million exemption over 20 years. It's not their tax dollars that are they're not a tax entity. They're not having to pay for the loss of tax revenue. That money impacts all these other taxing jurisdictions, the city of Austin, Travis County, Austin Independent School District, or maybe Estelle Valley, depending on where the project's located, Austin Community College, Travis County Health District. And so as a result, because of the level of the subsidy and the impacts it has on taxing entities and on taxpayers, I think it's really important that these deals receive the same level of scrutiny that developers receive when they apply for things like low-income housing tax credits or the city bond dollars. And I really think it's important in that analysis to really look at, examine closely, when does it make sense to use property tax exemptions to preserve or produce affordable housing, and just how should this tool be used? So in Texas, there are a number of different property tax exemption tools on the books to help preserve and produce affordable housing. And I want to give you just an overview of what the primary ones are before I dive into this newest tool that I think presents some of the biggest issues that we need to be examining. So first off, I want to touch upon just real briefly a tax exemption that is available for nonprofits that are creating affordable housing. It's a tax exemption that's for qualified nonprofit entities. They're eligible to receive a 50% property tax exemption on their affordable rental properties. And for those of you familiar with organizations like Foundation Communities, which is one of the largest affordable rental housing providers here in Austin, this is the exemption they're typically receiving on their multifamily rental properties. And the exemption actually used to be 100%. And those of us who've been around for a long time know about this. It was called the Chodo exemption. It was abused a lot by what we call faux Chodos, these sort of nonprofit entities that came in from out of town that really just were abusing the system. And so Texas legislature intervened, they reformed the program, they put a lot of guardrails in place for it, and they cut that exemption down back to 50%. As I mentioned, there are a lot of guardrails with this program. There's accounting, there's an annual audit required, there's monitoring of the program, there's some pretty deep income restrictions in place, all sorts of protections to make sure that the public benefits that come out of this exemption are worth the tax break. One thing I want to point out is in Harris and Dallas counties, they actually, affordable housing provider has to go to each taxing entity to get their permission to participate in this program. That's not the case in Austin or other parts of the state. But as the legislature was negotiating the different reforms, the officials in Houston and Dallas felt very strongly that they wanted to be able to have a say in projects that were approved. There's pros, but also definitely some cons that came with that. So the next slide here, and I want to spend some time talking about, is the property tax exemption that's available to publicly owned apartment complexes. And you'll see already, it's different. It's 100% exemption versus that 50% exemption. And under state law, state and political subdivisions of the state, that includes cities and counties, housing authorities and universities, as a general rule, they receive 100% property tax exemption on properties that they own and that they use for public purposes. Those are the two tests. They have to own the property and it has to be used for public purposes. And that applies to things beyond just affordable housing, but I'm going to be talking about how that applies to affordable housing today. So in terms of meeting the ownership test for apartment complexes, where typically a private investor or developer is partnering with the government to develop or own that complex, there's a whole complicated 5-part test, and I'm not going to go through that entire test with you, but the most important thing, this is sort of a typical structure. This is a low-income housing tax credit structure with the Fort Worth Housing Authority, and they set up a separate entity. And the main thing to keep in mind in terms of that ownership test is that the public entity has to be the general partner of this partnership entity that owns the affordable complex. So if the governmental entity is the general partner, in this case, it's a limited partnership, then it passes that test in terms of ownership, along with these other criteria I'm not going to go over. So in terms of public purpose, that second part of the test, it's actually very loosely defined under state law. So for public housing authorities, the only requirement that the public housing authority has to meet to show public purpose is that at least half of the units need to be income restricted to households making 50% to households making 80% or less of the median family income. In Austin, just as a reference point, that's about $79,000. It's not adjusted for family size, so it's $79,000 for a 1-person household or for a 4-person or 6-person household. Then there's also for Travis County and City of Austin and other cities that set up housing finance corporations as subsidiaries to do housing development. The test is it has to be intended to be occupied by persons of low or moderate income, 90% of the development. And I'm pretty sure that public purpose is not actually defined for other entities. We'll be talking about that a little bit in a minute. So one thing that a lot of people don't realize is that the housing authority of the City of Austin uses this structure a lot to acquire existing multifamily properties all around Austin in partnership with private investors. HACA, the acronym for the Housing Authority, owns close to 6,500 units with this structure. But one of the things that's challenging is like where these properties are actually pretty hidden. You can't, if you're a renter, you can't go to the Housing Authority's website to find out information on these properties and how to access them. By my estimate, just a rough back of the napkin kind of approach, these properties are cumulatively receiving a property tax rate of around $24 million a year. The income restrictions, I've just done a little bit of analysis, and I've been in conversation with the Housing Authority about these properties. The income restrictions are largely at that 80% MFI level. So what that means is that these units that are getting the tax break are more affordable, more at the margins compared to what you think about in terms of public housing that are deeply affordable, serving the most vulnerable renters in our community. And the rents of their properties are actually sort of pretty close to what you find with market rents. If you were to go on the market and try to rent, especially with efficiencies in 1-bedrooms, are very sort of close to that. You'll see a deeper subsidy when it gets to 2 bedrooms because of the mismatch there and what the market provides versus that 80% median family income level. But the upside of this from the Housing Authority's perspective and from the public's perspective is that HACA makes money off these deals that they can then use to subsidize things like public housing. This is a time where there's been declining federal support for things like public housing, so they can use this income to offset those losses. Also, they have a right of first refusal to purchase these properties. So when the investors cash out, they have a potential to provide for more permanently affordable housing. So Travis County and the Travis County Housing Authority also are using this structure to partner with private developers and investors who approach the county. And that also comes with that 100% property tax exemption. Travis County is actually in the process of developing a policy of when and how, coming back to those questions I posed earlier, of when and how this these partnerships should happen and when they should be basically awarding 100% property tax exemption to these projects. But prior to this time, they've actually taken, like most entities around the state, a pretty ad hoc approach to these partnerships. So some of the issues that the county is struggling with partnerships are some of the issues I'm going to be talking about now as I sort of jump into public facility corporations. This is actually the newest tax break that's available in Texas for affordable housing. And it's 100% property tax exemption for leasehold interest issued by public facility corporations to private developers. So like, what the heck does that mean? I had to create a chart to sort of kind of explain that. This is an offshoot of that government-owned property exemption that I just explained just a few minutes ago. So here is, well, first, let me sort of, before I even sort of show you sort of the structure. So let me sort of jump ahead. Nope, I'm going to jump back here. So public facility corporations, I just also want to point out, they've actually been around for a while. The PFC can be set up by a whole different bunch of governmental entities. Cities set them up, counties set them up, universities set them up. And they have the authority to issue bonds. And so what entities do is they create a public facility corporation to issue financing, to finance the construction of things like stadiums. The city of Austin did it for the Convention Center Hotel downtown. School districts have done it to sort of finance schools. But what the legislature did in 2015 is they made it easier for private developers and investors to partner with local governmental entities, public facility corporations, in order to receive 100% tax exemption on their apartment developments. And they did that by making leasehold interest tax exempt. So this is where I get super wonky and where maybe it gets a little boring. So just bear with me and then we'll jump into the flaws of this. But so under the new law, here's how it works. So a developer acquires land and then they transfer the land over to the governmental entity's public facility corporation. That's step 2 here. And then they'll lease the land back to the developer for 75. The governmental entity will lease it back to the developer for 75 to 99 years via a new partnership entity that's formed by the developer. And that's step 3 up here. The lease, also the ground lease, covers also the to be built, the future apartment complex to be developed on the land. And so then the developer builds that apartment complex and is exempt from 100% property tax exemption on paying any property taxes on the land or that apartment complex. Prior to the 2015 legislation, that long-term ground lease would have been subject to taxation. And because when you have a lease that long, all the value at that point in the property is in that lease. So that leasehold interest has the same kind of value that I talked about earlier, that sort of $1 million to $2 million a year tax break that's available through exempting this leasehold interest. I want to point out the partnership entity, this development partnership, it typically consists of, it's the developer, the investors. The governmental entity is also brought in as a partnership. It's a minor partnership interest, and they're a limited partner. They have more limited voting rights and control than they do under that earlier structure I shared with you in regards to the public entity exemption. So there are a lot of things that investors really like about this structure. Because the governmental entity is only a limited partner in that entity that holds a leasehold interest, it can be easily flipped to new buyers, usually without the authorization of the local governmental entity. So it makes it a really highly liquid asset that investors can come in quickly and they can sort of exit out quickly and cash out on their investment. Another reason they like that, and this is of course in addition to the property tax break, and I forgot to mention, there's a sales tax break associated with this structure as well. It is usually around $1.5 million a year. That covers, it's a 100% sales tax break that covers when you're building the apartment complex, all the building materials that you have to buy, like the sales taxes on that usually cost around $1.5 million. That's also exempt. But another reason why investors like the PFC tool is that it doesn't come with any restrictions either. That I mentioned earlier, that sort of public purpose test, that's really pretty much the only restriction that exists. It has to advance a public purpose. So for public housing authorities, similar to what I mentioned earlier, that public purpose test is defined in state law so that at least 50% of the units must be rented to individuals making up to 80% of the median family income. Again, in Austin, that's that $79,000 a year per household. Public purpose is actually not defined for other entities in the statute. So most are actually following the requirements for public housing authorities. It's like a safe harbor. So that 50% of the units not even affordable, they just have to be rented to households at 80% of the median family income or below. A couple things to point out. This is gonna get too wonky. I'm not gonna go into details, but those of you who really know affordable housing, I want to mention that income restrictions are not adjusted by household size as they are in other programs. So that 79,000 income restriction, that applies also to a single person renting an apartment as it does also a 4-person household. There are also no rent restrictions. There's no definition of what the rents need to be to actually truly be affordable to that household, unlike all other pretty much affordable housing programs. So basically what you're looking at is these deals under the state law restrictions. Now, a lot of local entities put in place their own restrictions, but based on the state restrictions, the rents at these properties for efficiency or 1 bedroom could be as high as $2,000 a month, which are levels that are really similar or oftentimes higher than market rates. Again, there's no other restrictions on the use of this tool, which is again, why investors really like it. So because of the highly lucrative nature of this exemption and the lack of any kind of guardrails or restrictions, over the past 3 years, there's really been an explosion of both apartment developers and investors seeking to use this tool. I have been doing research on this for several years, and when I talk to governmental entities in any part of the state, they say they literally have a line of developers and investors seeking to partner with them to be able to access this 100% tax exemption. So because of the lack of state guardrails and regulations, it really ends up being up to each local governmental entity to develop a program from scratch, to decide when and how to partner with these developers. And you sort of answer these questions. When should this make sense to use this tool, and how should it be used? So where we are today with this tool, a couple of governmental entities have been using the PFC leasehold exemption tool for a few years now, and they've developed some more sophisticated protections and adopted locally some guardrails and protections. But today, most governmental entities using this tool don't have any written policies in place or standards or benchmarks to decide when and how to use this tool. And in addition, many of the governmental entities with PFCs actually have a very limited capacity to do these deals. We have the Uvalde Housing Authority and the Taft Housing Authority. And some of the cities using these deals may not even have housing departments, people with the sort of expertise, like how to run a housing program. Another issue with this is that I call it sort of the race to the bottom. So even if you're a governmental entity and you put in place really good, strong, robust standards and deeper income targeting, a developer and investor coming to town can just shop around. Lots of governmental entities have PFCs, or they can ask a governmental entity to create a new PFC, so they can sort of shop around and get just sort of the best deal possible. And that may be a deal without any kind of really protections or robust public benefits. Another issue is this sort of issue I call sort of perverse incentives. Government entities often don't have any financial hit in approving these deals. So if it's a public housing authority's public facility corporation, it's not their taxes being given up. Again, a public housing authority is not a taxing entity. So when they approve these deals, there's not a financial hit to them. And so the cost of entering into these partnerships are what I call, and what we call over the law school, externalities. They don't have any, there is a cost, but they don't internalize that cost. That cost doesn't directly impact the governmental entity. And on top of that, governmental entities, they make money off these projects. So developers and investors negotiate with them and offer them some upfront cash. They often get that limited partnership interest, can get some cash out of the deal. And for public housing authorities, this is especially puts them in a hard place because, again, I mentioned those declining federal subsidies. So here's an opportunity to sort of make money off this program. And it's not necessarily in their interest to turn these deals away or to really give them the scrutiny that they probably, or that they do deserve, and to ensure that at the end of the day, that the public benefits actually outweigh that cost of those tax breaks. So what we found based on the research that we've been doing and with the support of fabulous CRP students is that in many of these deals, the tax breaks actually the cost of the loss of those taxes actually are greater than the public benefits being provided on these developments. Here's just a sort of example of this. This is from the City of San Antonio Housing Trust Corporation. This is one of the first PFC leasehold interest deals that was done in the state of Texas. Since this deal and since our report came out, we read a report on this a couple of years ago. The San Antonio Housing Trust has now adopted a lot more guardrails and some protections, but we see still a lot of deals like this around the state. And the property tax exemption was about $1.2 million a year of this property. There's the sort of total exemption over 10 years, sort of what the cost of that is, the local taxing entities, in contrast to the revenue going to the PFC. And the income restrictions, because they weren't adjusted for family size, the income restricted units were all sort of in the efficiencies in one bedroom. So really at the end of the day, it was serving renters at this sort of these higher income thresholds. And just at the end of the day, really sort of limited public benefits, because when you looked at the market rents of properties in that area, they were really equivalent to or similar to what this property is providing, even if this property was getting a really big tax break. So not surprisingly, and here's how I feel about this tool, but there are a lot of really flaws with this program. And I'm not abolishing advocating for the abolition of this program, but I do think it needs major reforms for it to be able to work both efficiently and equitably and effectively. So there's a bunch of different flaws we identified in the report we put out a couple of years ago, but I'm just going to touch upon some of what I see as the key flaws. So the first flaw is about that lack of political accountability to the taxing entities and taxpayers who are impacted by these deals. And I already touched upon this a little bit earlier in terms of those perverse incentives that many governmental entities have to approve these deals, given that it's not necessarily their tax dollars. But there's also the sort of political accountability issue in that, a lot of these deals, the entities doing them don't have any accountability whatsoever, political accountability to voters. So public housing authorities the board is appointed by the mayor. They're not elected by the taxpayers. And I think this raises an important just question in terms of accountability. Like, should the school districts whose board members are elected by the voters, the cities and counties whose leaders are elected by the voters, should they get a chance to weigh in on these deals? I don't know the answer to that question. I just pose that. I think it's an important question that needs to be explored. I just heard about this project recently, but to me, I think this highlights sort of everything that's wrong with this program. It's sort of the most glaring example of the issue with this lack of local accountability. So the SH 130 Municipal Management District in Travis County, the district was set up by the Texas legislature. Some landowners, developers approached the legislature about creating this special district. It's a small area around SH 130. That's that toll road that runs in eastern Travis County. And I'm pretty sure, but I'm not positive, that the landowners are also the board members. And last year, the district set up one of these public facility corporations that's approving tax exempt deals with apartment developers and owners of existing apartment projects, taking them off the tax rolls outside of Travis County. So they're, for a fee, you can pay them and they'll partner with you. And they're partnering in Hayes County, Bexar County, Harris County. It's really problematic. Like, why should this little entity, governmental entity in eastern Travis County, get to decide, okay, this apartment complex in Houston, yeah, we're going to partner with you. We're going to take it off the tax rolls that then impacts the Houston Independent School District, the city of Houston and Harris County. And those taxing entities don't get any say in that project. I think does a really good job highlighting what's wrong with this program. So my first recommendation is just really straightforward, limiting the types of entities that can utilize the PFC leasehold exemption for multifamily rental housing. I believe that only cities, counties, and public housing authorities should be able to use this tool, and they should only be able to use this tool within their jurisdictional boundaries. I also don't think that counties and county housing authorities should be using this tool within the city limits, because then you get that sort of issue of competition. I think they should only be able to use this tool outside of municipality and unincorporated areas. And I think there's still, a good question on the table, like for public housing authorities, because they lack that political accountability. Like, should cities and counties get to weigh in on those projects or not? I'm not sure the best answer to that, but it's a question that needs to be explored. The second major flaw has to do with the lack of a transparent and competitive process for these deals. So far, only the Houston Housing Authority and City of Dallas have a competitive process for these projects. They have a point system that they use in weighing the merits of different projects. Most of the public facility corporations around the state don't even have any written criteria they use to say, okay, here's how we evaluate what a good project is versus a bad project. Here's what we are giving priority to. We want to give priority to projects in high opportunity areas, near transit. We want to give priorities to projects that serve lower income households. They don't have that. This is the application for the Texas Essential Housing PFC, and it's like not much information. This is sort of what you have to sort of give them to sort of apply for the project. The Texas Essential Housing PFC is the PFC of that SH 130 municipal management district that I mentioned. You know, the lack of any kind of competitive and rigorous application process for such a lucrative program is unique. I mean, the low-income housing tax credit program has this very rigorous competitive process. The city of Austin's bond dollars that it gives projects, a very rigorous application process. This program, not the case. So these recommendations are sort of obvious. They sort of flow out of the flaw. But my second recommendation is to require a competitive and transparent process. And here's what I think it should be. I think there needs to be an RFP that's issued for these projects, or request for proposals that has a published point system that lays out, here's the government's priorities, and here's how we're going to weigh and compare projects to each other. I think the valuations when projects are selected need to be made public so that people can be aware, okay, this is why this project got selected and why this project did not. And then there needs to be an independent financial review, especially if that governmental entity doesn't have that in-house financial expertise to take the developer's numbers and determine, does this deal make sense? Is the tax base we're providing, is it outweighed by the public benefits that this project is providing to us? The third flaw, and this flows upon what I touched upon earlier, but you'll get the only restriction in state laws with public housing authorities, 50% of the units, and 80% of the median family income. But what we found in our research is that like very few deals, that's the state restriction, but even at the local level when this tool is getting implemented, very few of these projects have any kind of deeper income targeting. We're starting to see more since our report came out. In the past 2 years, there's been some deeper income targeting, but when our report came out a couple of years ago, what we found is that just this very tiny percent, 3% of the units were serving households or that were restricted to renters making 65% or below of the area median income. But yet, you know, by far, the biggest housing needs in our state, this is in the 4 largest counties in the state, are at those lower income levels by far. This is a chart, it's called severe cost burdens. This is a national calculation that's made. And if you have a severe cost burden, that means you're paying more than 50% of your income on rent. And you know, just looking at this chart here, there's where the needs are at those that especially at the less households making less than 30% area median income, but even at that below 60%. And when you get to those higher income levels, the needs are just not near as great. You can just go on Zillow and see, now where's the market? How's the market doing at serving households at these different income levels? I went on Zillow last night and pulled this up for you. I looked at for, you know, if I was a 2-person household looking for a 1-bedroom, and if I was at 50% of the median family income, making $40,000 a year, I can afford a rent of about $990 a month. And on the left, that's what comes up. It looks like a lot of them are in West Campus and maybe dorms. But I can guarantee that whatever the few properties that are up are probably in pretty deteriorated condition. On the right, I did the same thing for a 2-person household at 80% MFI. That's a rent of $63,000 when you adjust for family size. That's a rent of $1,600 a month. There's a lot of options available on the market for those households. And a lot of these properties are not subsidized. In our research, we also looked at sort of comps of properties, newer properties that have been built near these PFC deals, and found that in many cases that the rents at the surrounding complexes were below an 80% MFI rent at unsubsidized complexes. So recommendation number 3, require deeper income targeting. I think state law needs to be reformed on this, and I think at least 15% of the units should be targeted at households making below 60% MFI, median family income, and another 10% below 50%. The Travis County actually this week just approved one of these projects that's providing 50% of the units below 60% of the median family income without any additional public subsidy, but for this property tax break. And they also went through the City of Austin's affordability and low density bonus program. So you can get a lot, especially when you start combining tools without any additional subsidy. You can go a lot deeper when it comes to serving lower income households. Okay, fourth flaw, second to last one. So bear with me. And this is sort of related to what I was talking about earlier. This program doesn't have any other standards or guardrails in place that exist across pretty much all other affordable housing programs. At the state level, the only limit is that income level. And I just, there's no rent restrictions, no utility allowances. That's common in affordable housing programs where a family, the sort of benchmark for affordability is a family doesn't pay more than 30% of their income on rent and utility. So it's important that you also take utilities in place and coming up with like an affordable rent. These properties are not barred from discriminating against voucher holders. So tenants who have vouchers, even though that discrimination bar exists in other affordable housing programs. And I sort of touch upon some of these other things. This is just put these requirements in state law. That's a quick one. I'm gonna, but yeah, I think these kind of benchmarks that exist in other affordable housing programs should be built into the state statute. Okay, last flaw, and then we'll be open up to sort of questions. So the final flaw has to do with the lack of reporting and monitoring requirements. Unlike the tax exemption for nonprofits, which is ironically only 50%, even though they're doing a lot more deeper affordable housing, there's an annual audit that they have to file that has to be submitted to the state housing agency and the chief appraiser. The state's property tax exemption programs for economic development projects require rigorous reporting requirements to the state. There are no requirements whatsoever, reporting requirements for these deals. So if you want to find out where they exist and what they're doing and try to evaluate them, you have to actually send an open records request, oftentimes many open records requests, to every single governmental entity in the state, every appraisal district. It's just daunting. When we did this project a couple of years ago, it was the hardest part. It's like just trying to find out where these projects exist, how many they are, where they're located. And I'm actually have been trying to find out from that SH 130 PFC I mentioned. I've sent them an open records request, just trying to find out more where their projects are located, and they're refusing to release even the location of their projects. And they submitted a appeal to the Attorney General's office for an opinion saying they don't have to release the location of the deals that they have approved. So, transparency reporting is badly needed. And I think in terms of recommendations, like just at a minimum, there should be an annual audit, an annual report, and compliance reviews for these deals. And oh my gosh, it's 12:42. I finished 3 minutes early of my goal to spare you from talking about property tax exemptions for more than 45 minutes. So I think I did it. And so we have time for, just a discussion and questions. Everyone needs to stretch a little bit. Dr. Carter's stretching in the front row here, but we made it.
Great. Thanks so much.
Yeah.
Questions for Mr. Way?
Yeah.
So I know you're saying that it's really hard to even nail down where these are located. And I'm wondering from the data that you've been able to gather about that for existing projects, if there's any sort of interesting spatial distributions of where they're located, it's tending to be are any of them in sort of higher opportunity areas, or maybe it actually is really, really hard to get housing built in general, or is it tending to be more in places where there's a path of least resistance to getting it built?
That's a really good question. So we did look at that when we did the report. At the time we did the report, the two entities that had done the most of these deals or the two cities where you saw the most of these deals was the city of Houston and city of San Antonio. The City of San Antonio Housing Trust Corporation Trust Fund and their housing authority have both done well over 10 projects, and the City of Houston and the housing authority had done a number of different of these deals. So we did map the location. We were really interested in that question. And we found that, by and large, are in much more higher opportunity areas compared to things like low-income housing tax projects. And that's sort of the upside of not having to get the permission of the local city council, is that you don't have to then get that, go through that level of political scrutiny and be subject to kind of NIMBYism that you're otherwise going to be subject to. But so that's why we felt it was especially important that these properties be required to accept tenants with vouchers, because tenants with vouchers face very limited housing options. Low-income housing tax credit program projects are not allowed to discriminate against renters that have vouchers. You have a form of housing assistance to help pay their rent, but those projects have historically heavily been concentrated in low opportunity areas. So this to me is like a program that if reformed could be a great way to open up access to opportunities to some of the most vulnerable renters in our community who are right now really living largely in segregated low opportunity areas. Yeah. And on our report, I mean, if you like really want to like geek out, like and like pull up the whole report, like, but there's some maps on there where we did map the location of the project, and I think it would be great. Like, I'm hoping there was some attempts at legislative reforms this past session. They didn't pass, but there'll be more attempts this session. I hope at a minimum there will be a requirement for reporting so that we can just have the data, like where these properties are located. And it's a great future research project to map out the locations, because there's been dozens more of these deals approved since we first did the report. Yeah. Yes.
So you had that flow chart where you kind of laid out the PFC process.
Yes.
The ground lease part. I'm really interested. Okay, I'm really interested in that little like halfway point between 3 and 4.
Okay.
They lease it back to the entity, and I'm really curious because I'm thinking obviously that's an area of potential like value recapture for like the loss of the property tax if you're given like 100% exemption. And then it's even made more interesting when you make the point that the entity doesn't even have to be like the original government entity doesn't even have to be in the area in which it's renting it out. So I'm curious about, is that usually like, is that ground lease usually like a nominal amount that's just for the legality of creating that entity, or are the people who are, is this SH 130 district making a lot of money off of like projects in Harris County? Like that just seems like a really weird.
It really varies. Sometimes there's some kind of fee that's charged, like an application fee. The governmental entity their legal costs will be covered. Some have gotten a lot more sophisticated, like requiring more of a fee. But the more fee you require, the less affordable housing you're going to get to. The more that the governmental entity is making off of this structure, which has also been a source of contention. So a lot of the entities, they want the money. They don't necessarily want the deeper affordability. They want the cash that can be used for their other programs. So there's that tension there. But one thing that's really interesting on the leasehold structure is that what's typical in these ground leases, these 75, 99-year ground leases, is that if the exemption were to go away, it just reverts automatically back to the developer investors. The lease ends, it reverts back to them if the exemption never goes away. Oftentimes for just like $1. So it's really sort of, the structure is set up for the purposes of getting that 100% tax exemption. Yeah. Did that answer your question?
Yeah.
But you have really good comments too. Yeah. Start thoughts on that. Yeah.
It's just funny
Yeah,
how it's like such almost an insignificant piece on the flow chart, or it's not insignificant, but it's like,
It's like hidden a little bit.
there's just so much nuance, and it seems like
There's
there's a
lots.
lot of like shady things happening.
There is a lot of nuance there. Yeah, no, that's a really good point. Yeah. The question in the back.
Yeah, you had the slide with the 6 blue boxes.
Yeah.
And you mentioned that governmental entities don't take on this financial hit. I wanted to try to clarify what the financial hit was, and also like who was actually taking it if it's not the governmental.
So the financial hit is that loss of that property tax revenue. So if you're the city of Austin approving one of these deals, about roughly 20% of a property tax bill, when apartment landlord pays a property tax bill, about 20% of that property tax bill is the city of Austin taxes. So if you're the city of Austin or any city doing one of these deals, you're gonna lose what you otherwise receive in tax revenue. It's a smaller part of the tax bill. The biggest part of the tax bill, school districts, is about usually roughly around 50% of the tax bill. So about 50% when these deals are approved, about 50% of that lost revenue is revenue that would otherwise go to support public education in the state. I had another thought on that. Let me see if we'll come back about the tax revenue and okay, I've lost that thought, but maybe I'll pop back up. Yeah, no, Richard.
On this point of like the loss of revenue for education.
Yeah.
A good friend of mine is an attorney for, he just got a new job, so no longer, but he has been for a few years an attorney for different cities in New Jersey.
Oh.
And there's a lot of this like, deals where private developers get, 30 years of tax abatement and whatever. Exactly this conversation of like who pays that price ultimately in the loss of property tax revenue. The biggest entity is usually the school district.
Yeah.
And so he talked about how like they would go and kind of break the news to the school district that they're going to lose this revenue stream. But there was like some leeway for negotiation there, and they would negotiate back from the developers like either a lump sum or an annual stream that goes directly to the school district so that the school district keeps up, because they kind of negotiate like you need to sell based on school districts too. You need to keep the school district going.
Yeah.
Has any of that happened in Texas with any of those?
It hasn't. So those are called like pilots, so payment in lieu of taxes. And so I've seen it in deals with the entity that's negotiating the deal, because they're the ones that hold all the cards. So City of Bernie, for example, they approved one of these partnership projects and they got reimbursed for their lost property tax revenue. So they were made whole, but none of the other taxing entities were. So they got paid back sort of their cut of what they would have lost in property taxes. But no, I have not seen that sort of any kind of fees paid to school districts. That SH 130 municipal management district is sort of one of the newest PFCs in the state. They the only deal that they did reveal to me which is closed is actually in Travis County. The other ones, they've approved deals they haven't closed in those other counties I mentioned. It's like 700 apartment complexes in eastern Travis County, not necessarily a high opportunity area. And those presumably there'll be a lot of families with kids going to Del Valley ISD, which is already a very low income school. And I saw no indication whatsoever that the school district has been drawn into that conversation about the loss. You're going to have all those families moving in. Your Tesla's going to be out there, just of what that means for the school when you're going to have tons more kids coming into schools and losing sort of property tax base. And was there a question? Were there any questions? Okay, yeah.
Yeah, what would it take for these recommendations to be implemented at the state level? And the public finance corporations could apply this individually, right? They're allowed to, or they can have like additional requirements.
Good question. So yeah, the state, as I mentioned, there's that one restriction at the state level, and that's in state law. And so at that point, it really is up to each local governmental entity to design its own program, and the sky's the limit on what they could do. I mean, at some point, you're not gonna have anyone partnering with you, so you've got to weigh the balance again. Like, who do we want to partner with? How do we want to partner with? And what do we want the outcomes to be? But yeah, so local government entities, it's up to them if there's going to be any kind of guardrails or restrictions to them to adopt it. And what's it going to take for state reforms? I think, a number of things. And one is just sort of heightened awareness. Like, again, like people don't like to, this is like sort of complicated, messy stuff. And, taxes, it's like hard to understand, write down. And our legislature only meets every other year. They got super short bandwidth, this kind of stuff. But there is a heightened awareness of this. There is actually a legislative a call that's gone out to like study this issue and come up with some recommendations for the next session. So I'm hopeful that at a minimum there'll be just a basic level of reforms in terms of just that transparency and accountability piece, because it seems like there's a lot more common ground on that. There's a lot more controversy about any kind of deeper income targeting. This tool is sold as like sort of this missing middle, sort of we need more to sort of attract middle income workers and support them. I think there's some sort of myth behind that, because I showed you what the market is already doing to serve that part of our community. But that's sort of, legislators like to support middle class. They don't like to support low income households. So that's the barrier. Yep.
I'm wondering about the MFI calculations. and
Yes.
How frequently those are updated.
Yeah.
You know, I'm thinking about how quickly the housing market has changed
Mm-hmm.
across the country, but like especially in Austin.
Yeah.
For the past couple of years, and so 80% MFI changed a lot faster than people's incomes.
Yeah.
So that, and the numbers that you're throwing up, I think, are the more like present day MFI calculation.
Yeah, so MFI is adjusted every year. It's by head. It's a calculation they come out where they say, here's a median family income for, and it's not just City of Austin, you know, it sounds like you're familiar, it's for the metro area, Austin and Round Rock and surrounding jurisdictions. But it is updated every year. I mean, one of the challenges Austin faces is that our incomes go up or MFI levels go up, but like rents are going up more than MFI levels. And so one argument for that sort of that 80% MFI targeting is, yes, the market's is currently doing a decent job of serving that, but like if we continue this trajectory, like rents went up some insane amount this past year. I can't remember what, like some just ridiculous number. If we continue on that trajectory where rents are going up higher than those MFI incomes and MFI levels, that at least now, like Austin Housing Authority's law, they have these 6,000 plus units that at some point that 80% MFI restriction is going to be lower than what the market would provide. I don't think I answered your question though. Okay. Yeah.
So I have a follow-up question on that. I just want to make sure I'm understanding this. So the people who are like meeting the like quote unquote affordability requirements for these, like they have to be at these income levels, but there's no restriction on what the rent they're paying is providing. So there's nothing that says that they're only paying 30% of their income.
That's correct. Yeah. So the benchmark for affordable housing programs, you don't pay more than 30% of your income on rent and utilities. At the state level, there are no rent restrictions in place. Some, and more so after a report came out, more local entities are starting to adopt their own rent restrictions. Sometimes it's 35%. We've seen some 35%. There's never any utility allowances included. But some still don't have any kind of rent restrictions. And so, I mean, there's a limit, like a developer's not like, typically they do this like 3-to-1 ratio. Like there's a cap of what they're going to charge in rent based on someone's income, but it's not the standard. It's not 30%.
Right.
So yeah, it's a big problem.
Just to follow up on that, so it's literally just about the income that the person, so that particular person, their income, they have to be in a unit and then we satisfy the criterion, and that's it. So there's nothing stopping the landlord from setting the
Raising the
market
rents
rent,
way higher
not
than
paying the property tax, and then also setting the rent as if they were paying the property tax.
Yeah,
And
exactly. Yes, exactly.
that's just.
Yes.
2 questions. I think a couple of slides below, I just want to make sure
Yeah.
I saw it right. You had
Like later or earlier?
later, I think it was later.
You like my developers lined up. I was trying to like, I had like very crude PowerPoint. And it was like, I'm trying to like money and like briefcases.
Is that we're outraged at this policy.
Those are my
That was my
developers.
interpretation.
Oh, those are the developers lined up. Okay. Applause.
I'm trying to remember which slide it was. It was the slide that you had like the comps versus the what like the projects were at. Did one of them show that it's like far more like that negative gap?
Yeah.
The subsidized or like this that's crazy. Okay.
Well, the Cedar Heights, I mean, it was a very high opportunity area. It's near downtown. So this is an example. Yeah, like it. In that case, if you looked at other new luxury housing being built in that area, that those rents were above 80% MFI. And so in that case, that for that particular part of the city, their what the Houston Housing Authority was doing, even at that 80% AMI threshold, was better than what the market was doing. But this is a much rarer case from what we found in our analysis.
I was just gonna say, my last question is, do you have hope for anything? Like,
I always have hope here. If you give up hope.
And like every single time I did, like I just was Mueller's housing class,
Oh.
and I just like, I'm constantly just like really, really down every single time I think about anything that's happening with housing. So it seems like such a daunting thing to just get.
It's not daunting, but I guess you just, I do a lot of work at the grassroots level, so I see all these like great things happening, and so there's lots of reason for hope. But yeah, if you start looking too macro, and it's easy to get doom and gloom and to not want to crawl out of bed in the morning. So just try to keep it grassroots.
While waiting for a reform, would it be possible to create different deals while still not losing that competitiveness against other finance corporations? Like deals where it's 100% tax exemption, but not a sales tax exemption, but you have to give us like less fees. It's like we'll charge you less amount of fee, a lower fee, but deeper, kind of like play around with like deeper affordability, no fee. Yes to sales.
I think it's easy. Let me know if I'm not, maybe not 100% sure if I'm getting where you're at, but let me just take a stab at it. So that sort of race to the bottom that I talked about, that sort of challenge, like as long as there's no state standards and it's up to each individual entity to adopt its standards, it's sort of like who has the weakest standards. That's who you're going to go to if you're an investor developer. Like, where do I pay the least amount of money to the entity? What's the sort of highest income residents I can serve? That's who you're going to go to as investors. So yes, as an entity, you can definitely, you can't play around with the numbers. So the tax is like, you can't just have to do a 50% property. Like it's 100% property tax exemption. That's a state law. It's 100% sales tax exemption. You could require reimbursement of some of that, but that's state law, and that is administered. Property tax exemptions in the state are administered by the appraisal district according to state law. So it's not like when the Travis County does one of these deals, it's not like they're issuing the tax exemption. They're entering into the structure that then under state law comes with this 100% property tax exemption. Is that?
Yeah.
Okay.
I have two things. First, I guess in response to Nancy's question, I'm going back to that geographical element where it's like, it doesn't matter. So my first thought before you made that point in your presentation was, well, Austin can get away with having higher standards because it's a desirable area, but it doesn't matter because they can get that, the developer can get that exemption from the SH 130 group.
Exactly.
It doesn't matter at the city. So that's just messed up to me.
Yeah.
That's like the wildest part of anything you've said today to me. But I want to ask, in your research, I wonder if you found any information about how this partnership or this idea was introduced. Like, because like it seems like the flaws you pointed out are pretty, like, I don't think they were hidden. They seemed like they would have been there from the beginning as a problem, like it's kind of obvious. So I'm wondering, like, just who was pushing for this? Like, who was lobbying?
Yeah, that's such a good question. So we did go back and look at the legislative history of the 2015 amendment, and it was it's rumored to be been drafted by one of the biggest users of this. There's a development group that's the biggest user of this tool in the state, that they played a really key role in drafting that amendment. And it was as things happen in our Texas legislature, it was sort of snuck into legislation at the very last minute. It wasn't a bill that was filed at the beginning of the session. It was vetted. It was offered as a floor amendment to another bill, and the Senate sponsor actually got a question. So like, what does this like tax exemption thing do? And is this something that would help nonprofits or for-profits? And the amendment sponsor, oh no, this would only help nonprofits. This is not a tax exemption that would help for-profits. And then they voted on it and it became law. So yeah, interesting history there. Yeah.
We do have a question online from Michael Owen.
Oh, okay. Hello.
So Michael, I hope you can hear, you can unmute and ask. I think we'll
Hey Heather, can you hear me?
It's really weird that you're like, I'm staring at this owl-shaped creature. And
Can you hear my question?
Can you hear me?
Yeah. Yeah, okay, so I think my one question I had was answered earlier. So literally, one of these entities in a particular area or jurisdiction can go all the way across the state and develop this property wherever they want. So this SH 130 outfit can go to, Corpus Christi.
So it depends on the governmental entity and like what its powers are in the state law. And this is where sort of my familiar with the state law sort of breaks down. I think there is some question of whether this SH 130 entity can actually go and partner in Houston, but they're doing it. But there have been some people called and questioned, is that legal or legitimate? I just can't, I haven't done the deep dive in the legal research to be able to say either way.
Yeah, well, I read your report. It was a terrific report. And I mean, that's even more scandalous than this problem is.
Another thing that's even more scandalous about it.
Yeah, if these entities can go all over the state and develop these things.
But also what we found so far, and this is YouTube, so this is probably, who knows who's watching this, but but we found so far is that I got the records for the first deal that they've closed, and the landowner for this property that is going to be in this POC project it was owned by the president of the board of this SH 130 Municipal Management District. So there's really major concerns also of self-dealing, coming back to that accountability piece. The other deal that we found out about is advertised on the internet, the one in San Marcos. That land and that deal is owned by an entity that is we're one of the owners of the entity that owns that land is the president of the board of the PFC. So and it's been rumored that is happening in a lot of their deals.
Yeah, one final comment. I mean, in terms of the kind of thinking about this and in terms of public benefits or, cost benefit terms, when you build one of these projects and you attract residents from outside, whatever the jurisdiction is, you're actually increasing the public service cost for the jurisdiction just as you're taking away all their tax revenue to pay for it. So, all the public expenditures that will be associated with somebody from outside the jurisdiction coming in and living in one of these projects, those aren't even, I would say they should be accounted for, because you're sending a bunch of new kids to school just as you're taking the tax revenue away from the school. So it's like, that has to be considered on top of everything else, I would just say.
Yeah. Thanks for raising that. Yeah, I think, coming back to that project in Eastern Travis County, that 700 unit apartment development that's gonna be going in, like that's a big deal there. And in an area that is really otherwise pretty cash strapped, right? Like Del Valley is a very poor school district and such. So good point.
To that, I'd be curious to know if there's also a relationship in here with like board members of major charter schools, because that seems like it's an opportunity for charter schools to exploit like breaking down of school systems and then step in, and they're allowed to fundraise in ways that those public schools are not, and they can kind of fill that gap.
So is that a question like, in terms of charter schools being able to set up public facility corporations and use this tool?
No. I'm saying, I like understanding how charter school boards work. Those board members are involved in many other things. For example, maybe development of properties. And so if I'm a charter school board member who also is a land developer and I'm cashing in on this, I have an opportunity to also expand my charter school network by breaking up the school system. That's a heavy charge, I know, but there is like ultimately, whether it's an active decision like that or not, like that is a story of how charter schools have moved into different places, and it like is ultimately a practicization and public education in that process.
I was not familiar with that history. Yeah.
This is maybe a little bit too big of a question, but I'm just processing this thing, and I mean, it's very clear that it needs a lot of guardrails, like some really big, thick
Yeah.
guardrails on it. But I'm also wondering, like, you know, coming from a perspective of just like, we just need more housing, like, so desperately,
Yeah.
especially in places like Austin. And just the fact that it is, you know, like you said, developers are lining up for this, like, do you think there's any kind of positive, like, lessons learned from it, of like how, you know, ways that you could potentially like reform like some existing incentives that are like really maybe hard to access, or you know, they're not that effective because they're like so cumbersome, like from a regulatory standpoint. Like, do you see anything from this that like maybe would be potentially like transferable to other programs that do have already sort of like a framework set up to make sure that they're actually achieving public good? Like I said, it's kind of a big question, so.
Yeah, I don't, what are your thoughts on that? I haven't, that is a big question. I haven't, yeah, and again, I'm not advocating for the abolition of this tool. It needs, sometimes a little bit slowing down, and this is sort of the risk, right? You don't want to slow it down so much that then to the extent there is value in this tool that it just becomes impossible to work with. So one of the, if you had an RFP process, for example, like it can't be a year-long RFP process because
Right.
these development opportunities happen quickly and you just could be very problematic. But yeah, I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm still like.
It's just, by the way, a famous way to, if I don't know the answer to the question, just put it back on the question.
Well, I mean, I'm still like at very much at the stage in my, you know, learning about all the different
Yeah.
incentives that are out there,
yeah.
and just thinking about
Mm.
what, I mean, it's, I just feel like with affordable housing, a lot of times you just do see this sort of like layering of more and more,
Yeah.
like, well, we're giving these people a break, so we're gonna like add all this stuff to it, and it ends up just like making it almost impossible to happen, and it's like, I think that's maybe the wrong approach too, but there's like somewhere in the middle.
That's low-income housing tax credit example. I mean, there are way more people wanting to do low-income housing tax credit developers than there are the money available. And yet it's also a very competitive, it's a rigorous project. It's made a lot more improvements. That those protections used to not always be in place. There have been people that have gone to jail over that program because of the level of corruption, but the recognition of the sort of same issues you see here, like the legislature intervened and put in place a lot of guardrails and made it, I think, a much stronger, better program as a result. And yet it is still, I mean, the problem is there's just not enough. There's other issues with that program too, but one of them is not hampering development in terms of, I mean, there are, again, more people lined up applying for tax credits than there are credits available.
Could you speak about some of the guardrails and safeguards that have been implemented in other jurisdictions?
Locally with this tool?
Yes.
So San Antonio Housing Trust, I think our report played a big role, as well as local housing advocates, taking the recommendations in the report, is they put in place, they adopted some tenant protections. So one of our, I didn't get present this today, one of our recommendations was to, for all these deals, to put in place protections for the tenants. This is a growing best practice. City of Boston does it in its projects that it funds. Texas is a very landlord-friendly state. Tenants have very few protections, but there's an opportunity through these government subsidy programs to put in place some basic protections. And so the city of San Antonio did adopt those. They are doing some deeper income targeting. It's not great, but it's better. It's like a 10%, I think, targeting. They have rent restrictions. I don't think they have utility allowances, but they have like a 30% rent restriction. I'm pretty sure they do. I don't think they've moved to an RP process. The Houston Housing Authority, as I mentioned, has an RP process. They also are they have rent restrictions. I think it's usually 30% of the median family income. I don't know if that's written into policy though, but it's actually a practice that they've been following. I've seen in their deals as I've reviewed them, some of the things. And I've seen more of these local entities not barring discrimination against voucher holders. Not a lot, but I am like City of San Antonio Housing Trust. I'm pretty sure that they adopted, that they're putting that into their legal documents, that you can't discriminate against voucher holders. Now, the question is like how many tenants with vouchers actually end up successfully moving into these properties is a issue that will need to be examined and there's gonna need to be more advocacy around that, because it's not just enough to get rid of that prohibition against discrimination. I think you gotta do affirmative marketing, and how, if you're a renter with a voucher, how do you know that this property even takes vouchers and things like that? Are we on time?
Yeah, we're doing good on time. So yeah, if there are no additional questions.
Yeah, because it's standing in the way between everyone and the sunshine and stuff.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Thanks.
Yeah.